So the Fed was set up to be self-funding, and the way it funds itself is not relying on the federal government for its budget, for its operating budget. The way it funds itself is the Fed earns interest on the assets that it owns, which at this point are mostly U.S. government bonds, which are called U.S. Treasuries, as well as mortgage-backed securities, MBSs, which are packages of mortgages. And if you have a mortgage, it's probably sitting somewhere inside of an MBS. So the Fed earns interest on the assets that it owns. The Fed also pays out interest to the commercial banks and the money market funds that hold some of their money with the Fed in the form of bank reserves and what you may have heard called reverse repos. So in normal times, the Fed is earning more in interest than it's paying out. And this is the Fed's earnings. It earns some interest on the assets it owns. It pays out interest to the commercial banks and money market funds, and it makes a profit, and that is the Fed's earnings. And then these earnings are used to pay the Fed's operating budget, salaries, electricity for the money printers, etc. These earnings are also used to pay a dividend to the commercial banks who are technically shareholders in the Fed. I believe this is a rather small dividend. And then the bulk of the money actually gets paid back to the U.S. Treasury. By law, any excess profits are required to be paid by the Fed back into the U.S. Treasury. And so this helps to fund the U.S. government's, the federal government's operating budget. Over the past decade, this has averaged about $100 billion per year. So it's a large amount of money. And this was some nice extra spending money that the federal government could use for its many worthless and bureaucratic and violent projects. But then something changed in the last couple of years. What happened is the Fed hiked interest rates so quickly that it blew itself up, just like the Swedish central bank did, as we talked about in last Friday's video. By hiking interest rates, the Fed tanked the value of the assets that it's holding on its balance sheet. When interest rates go up, the price of bonds like mortgage-backed securities and U.S. Treasuries goes down, so the asset value declines. Also, by hiking rates, the Fed also increased the amount of interest that it needs to pay the commercial banks and the money markets that are parking money with the Fed. And so what's happening today is the Fed is paying out more in interest to these banks and money markets than it is receiving interest from the assets that it holds, those treasuries, those government bonds, and those mortgage-backed securities. So now every year the Fed is actually losing money. It's a money-losing bank. But the Fed is not like you and me or even a regular bank. Fortunately for the Fed, it gets to make up its own accounting rules, and here's how that works. As we discussed before, the Fed normally owes excess profits, excess earnings to the U.S. Treasury, and this has averaged about $100 billion per year. But today the Fed has no profits. It has no net positive earnings because it's paying out more money than it's receiving. There is a rule that says that the Fed does not need to pay any money to the U.S. Treasury out of its earnings until it has recouped all of its operating losses or all of its investment losses. So if the Fed loses $100 billion in 2023, it will not have to pay back any excess profits to the U.S. Treasury until it recoups or makes back that $100 billion. And now, thanks to the magic of central banker accounting, that $100 billion becomes what's called a deferred asset that the Fed can park on the asset side of the Fed's balance sheet. The opposite of a liability, in other words, a negative liability, becomes an asset and it gets moved over to the asset side of the Fed's balance sheet. And what's weird about this is the more money that the Fed loses, the more its asset value actually goes up because it gets to add more and more deferred assets to the asset side of the balance sheet. Must be nice